continue reading your bedtime story, and we're reading Palace Wagon Family, the true story of the donor party. So, one of the most difficult parts about traveling westward um, from Missouri to California, most of the journey was pretty flat because you were traveling across the Great Plains. However, the worst part about traveling across the Great Plains was that you would run into rivers. And sometimes they would be small rivers that your wagon could drive through. Sometimes they would be large rivers that were really wide, and your wagon would have to cross the rivers. There were a couple of different ways to cross. One way you could cross would be to float your wagon across. You would let the horses loose, they would swim across the water, you would lead them through the water to the other side of the river, and you would float your wagon with all of your belongings in the wagon across the river. That was a very risky way of crossing the river because you might lose all your possessions, lose your horses. And also, there were things floating in the river, like there might be snakes in the river, or big chunks of wood or what have you in the river that would run into your wagon or run into you as you were crossing. Another way to cross a river would be a lot of Native Americans saw that all these people were coming. They saw all these settlers. They knew that they were heading westward. And so, one of the ways that they made money off of the settlers was to build big, huge rafts. And they were rafts made out of logs tied together. And then what they would do is they would put your wagon on the raft and they would push your wagon across the river. And you would have to pay for that service, obviously, because it was very risky for the Native Americans that were also crossing the river with all of your stuff aboard. So there were lots of different ways that people would cross a river. So you're going to see that they're going to start running into some rivers, and there's going to be different ways that they cross the river and rivers. And one of the big problems is going to be their big, huge palace wagon, which is going to make it difficult to cross rivers. It's kind of a it's like going it's the difference between going backpacking and wearing a backpack and taking a camper full of everything you own. So they're taking all of their stuff in this big, huge wagon, and it's going to be really difficult. Everything they do is going to be harder because they have so much stuff. All right, here we go. We sure will, the young men in the company shouted. Let's have that chorus again. Milt Elliott had caught on to the tune and wanted to try it on his mouth organ. Virginia only half listened to the words. Finally, it came time to part with those who had come this far on the journey. Editor Francis of the Illinois Journal was there to report everything for the paper. I'll publish any interesting letters you people send back, Virginia heard him telling Mrs. George Donner. She was Aunt Tam to the Reed children. Jacob Donner's wife was Aunt Betsy, and John Denton almost immediately became Uncle John. They were like one big happy family as they started off again in the morning. The teamsters were singing to the tune of the rattling tin pails underneath the wagon frames. We are bound for the promised land. We are bound for the promised land. Oh, who will come and go with us? We are bound for the promised land. Many did go with them. At Belleville, just before they crossed the Mississippi, they were joined by the Eddies with their two small children. Later, as they traveled across Missouri, they took on the Keysburgs, the Wolfingers, the Breens, and the Murphys, a great big tribe of them. Mrs. Murphy was a widow, and two of her daughters were married and had children of their own. She also had a daughter, Mary, about Virginia's age, and several boys. 6 more boys had spilled from the Breen wagon. Isabella, the only girl in the family, was a nursing babe. When we go to San Juan Bautista on our field trip, they have Isabella Breen's wedding dress in the museum there. So when she actually was crossing to California, she was just a baby. On sunny days, camp was pitched early to give the children a chance to play in the open air. If it rained, the mud stopped them, and then Grandma Keys would fret and complain that they weren't getting on with the journey. She enjoyed the motion of the wagon. It gave her a feeling that she was going somewhere, she confessed. California, breathed Virginia. Every day brought them a little nearer to their goal. Nights were exciting with songs or stories around the blazing campfires. As soon as the oxen began to act tired from their day's journey, Virginia would jump on her pony and ride ahead with her father to pick out the next camping ground. Brush would then be piled high with the fires kindled outside the circle of the wagons. Within the circle, or corral as the men called it, the cattle and horses would be set free to graze with the oxen until chain up time came again in the morning. This was sheer pleasure. By the 11th of May, the wagons were entering the bustling town of Independence, Missouri, the last outpost of civilization. Camp was pitched not far from crossing the trails. So, this one city, Independence, Missouri, knew that everyone was going to be taking off for the West from their city. So, their city had this whole industry based on people heading west. Like they had wagon stores and they had food supply stores and they had markets where you could buy oxen. They knew that everyone was going to be traveling west from Independence, so their city sort of became the place where you buy your supplies to go west. All right, let's see. Prairie schooners were everywhere. Hawkers were selling their wares, shouting up and down between the lanes of wagons. Rough men with mule teams just in from the Santa Fe trail. Soldiers, trappers, Spaniards with their tassels and bells all met and traded stories of Indian raids with each other until Virginia was almost sorry that she had no Indian story to tell. Grandma, where are all those Indians you told us about? The younger children asked. You'll see 'em soon enough, she warned. Too soon, maybe. What's all that racket outside? Why are the wagons stopping? Indians, Jimmy shouted. Come and see. They have to take us across the river. Now, thought Virginia, there will be a real adventure. They had reached the Kaw River and must cross it on a ferry barge kept by a Frenchman and his Kansas squaw. The next chapter is called Across the Rivers. They were just as tame as pet canaries, Virginia said in disappointment when they were safely across the river and she dared breathe again. Instead of sinking the boat in midstream as she half expected, the Indian helpers had shot it skillfully over to the other side, where they had held out their big hands with grunts of thanks for the coins they received in payment. Did you see them, Patty? Jimmy asked. Little dark-eyed Martha shook her head. She had not left her grandmother's side. We have to take care of her, she explained gravely. I thought Grandma was going to take care of us, Virginia laughed. After all, this is wild Indian country. They had already passed what Mr. Thornton called the last fixed abode of a white man. He and Mrs. Thornton, who had their own wagon train, had joined the Reed Donner train at Independence. They were writing a book of their travels. Often they could be seen scribbling away with their dog Darko looking on as if he had a part in it too. He seemed to look down his nose at the other dogs, especially the Breen's noisy little Towser. The Thorntons were said to be real aristocrats. Hiram Miller, one of James Reed's 4 teamsters, was keeping a less pretentious book for the Reed Donner party. A line of writing took care of each day's journey. The day-by-day account began when they left Independence on the 12th of May. They crossed the Kaw River on the 19th, and that same afternoon overtook still another wagon train. In it were many distinguished people, including a former governor of the state of Missouri. He was supposed to be waiting in camp for his brother-in-law, Alfonso Boone. He's Daniel Boone's grandson, a girl from the new wagon train told Virginia. I've read his story. Daniel Boone's, I mean. It's back in the wagon. Virginia was proud of her family's books. That great big wagon? The new girl was impressed. We call it the Palace Wagon, Virginia explained. Pa built it for Grandma. She traveled the Wilderness Road with Daniel Boone. Now we're bound for California. We're going to Oregon. It's safer now that the Mexicans have declared war. Is your father the captain of your party? I guess so. He organized it. Virginia was a little slow to reply. This was the first she had heard about the war. She wished she understood it better, but she was too proud to ask questions. We call ourselves the Reed Donner Party, she added. I am Virginia Reed. My father has gone to apply for permission to your wagon train. My father has gone to apply for admission to your wagon train. Mr. Reed's application was accepted. On the morning of May 20th, they all started off together, a great train of prairie schooners stretching out for 2 miles along the trail. Instead of George Donner's "Chain up, boys," a trumpet gave the signal for starting, for now Captain Russell was in charge. With him were a number of soldiers on their way to the new frontier. Previous storms had already swollen the rivers they must cross. Another one came up suddenly after 8 miles of traveling with the mammoth wagon train. At noon the sky darkened and the wind blew, such an unexpected gust that it tore off several wagon covers. With the wind came a downpour of rain. It's a cloudburst, declared Mrs. Reed, hurrying to make sure the rain wasn't coming in on Grandma's bed. She complained of being cold, and another quilt was spread over her. Mary Donner rushed in with her 3 little brothers. The top of our wagon blew off. The big boys are helping Pa fix it, she explained. Is it all right if we stay with you? Mary and her brothers stayed, but not for the usual hot meal. Nobody cared about going outside to cook supper in the pouring rain, and Eliza had not yet learned to manage the cook stove inside the palace wagon. She said a little snappishly, Virginia thought, "You can get along on cold food like other folks." It took some time to repair the wagons and anchor the canvas tops more securely to their mooring pins. Grandma fretted and Eliza scolded. The day ended dismally enough, but in the morning the sun was out and the birds were singing as cheerfully as before, and the grass was even greener. The bedding that had been exposed to the rain was dried in the warm sunshine. Nobody seemed any worse for the delay. By noon, the wagons were again on the move. And I think we're going to stop right there. All right, so we will pick up where we left off. So they've already crossed their first river, and they're on their way, and they've joined a larger wagon train. The reason why people traveled west in wagon trains was for protection, for safety. If there were a whole bunch of you all together traveling, it was a lot safer. It was safer. There was sort of safety in numbers, right? So a lot of people wanted to go together so that if a wagon broke down, you could help each other repair it. If your wagon train got attacked, you could fight off the attackers, right? Any kind of problems that you had, it was usually better to have the problems in a large group than to have them by yourself and to be on your own. So they joined a larger wagon train that is heading to California and to Oregon. All right. Thanks so much for joining me.